Hello, my name is Olivia Mattis. I'm delighted to welcome you today to our program called Let My People Go, the Rescue of Soviet Jewry. Now, the Sousa Mendes Foundation is a Holocaust remembrance organization. And every Sunday since the beginning of COVID, we've been presenting beautiful stories of rescue and resistance. And typically we stay within our period of history that we remember, namely World War II and the Holocaust. But today's program is an exception. Today, we're focusing really on the greatest rescue action in Jewish history in the 20th century, which resulted in the exodus ultimately of around 1.5 million Jews living under the Soviet regime. And it's quite a story. And I hope you got to see the film Refusenik that tells really the full history of that story. Today we have a moderator who is my good friend and colleague, Robert Jacobitz. He will introduce our speakers and tell a little bit about his own role in this history. So Robert, take it from here.
Thank you, Olivia, for your kind introduction. And just before I introduce the presenters, I invite the audience to please post questions you may have in the chat icon at the bottom of this link. And now it is my distinct honor to introduce three individuals who each had a remarkable role in the effort to rescue Jews from the Soviet Union. Our first presenter after the introductions is Jerry Goodman, who in 1971 was the talented organizer with the vision and chutzpah to create the largest American Jewish organization, the National Conference on Soviet Jewry, commonly referred to as the NJSJ. And its sole purpose was to agitate for the rescue of Jews from the prison called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. Our next speaker will be Semyon Pinchasoff, an individual with many talents. I initially only knew of him as being a documentary filmmaker and creator of one titled With God Against Man, which documents the story of Aristides de Sousa Mendes and a group of visa recipients from him seeking knowledge about his life. It is one of several films the foundation distributes for showing to interested groups. Semyon left the Soviet Union in 1976 and worked for the exit of his refusenik cousin and internationally known classical music pianist Vladimir Feltzman, his wife Anna, and son to the United States in 1987. Our next presenter will be Dorit Perry, who as a high school student living in the San Francisco, Oakland Bay area, attended protests in front of the San Francisco Soviet consulate in support of Jewish emigration. And after law school, was employed by HIAS as the chief immigration lawyer at its Rome, Italy reception center from 1989 to 1990. There, she oversaw the processing of 42,000 stateless Jews, individuals and families, for eventual resettlement in the free world. Between Semyon's and Dorit's presentation, I will give mine as the leader of a group of Oakland area physicians and spouses visiting refusenik families in 1988, delivering much needed medicines and videotaping testimonials for supporters in the free world. Jerry, please now share with us your role with the NCJS.
Thank you, Robert. Perhaps at first, I will begin with some generalized comments. The American Soviet Jewry advocacy movement is considered one of the most influential movements of the American Jewish community in the 20th century. The beginnings of that movement became a model for other efforts to help the Soviet Jewish minority at that time, about 3 million, to achieve their basic human rights. The movement can be traced to the early 1960s, when the first organizations were created to address the specific problem of the religious and national rights of Soviet Jews which had been deprived. Those groups included the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews, but the primary and largest organization on behalf of the organized Jewish community was the National Conference on Soviet Jewry. And in 1971, I was asked to organize that body. At its peak, it consisted of over 300 local Jewish community groups and every major national organization. So I will begin with a set of slides and with some commentary. The first slide, yes. In 1970, December 1970, on Human Rights Day, the Jewish community of Washington, D.C., one of our strongest local affiliates, started a vigil opposite the Soviet embassy. It lasted for 20 years. There was a vigil every day, and Jewish groups were alerted that if they were traveling to Washington, they should join. Leonid Slepak, who you can see, was freed from the Soviet Union at that time, but he was agitating on behalf of his parents, Volodya or Vladimir and Maria or Masha Slepak. Next slide, please. Now, having said that, the movement for Soviet Jews, the advocacy movement, was not located only in the United States. Here we have one example of a group of 35 women call themselves the 35s, the Women's Campaign for Soviet Jewry. They chose the number 35 to signify the arrest of Raisa Polotnik, who was arrested on her 35th birthday. So it was truly a global movement. Next slide, please. Since the movement was local, we saw a little bit of Washington, D.C. Every major city and smaller communities had Soviet Jewry demonstrations at one time or another. This one with Mayor Ed Koch was in New York City, organized by the National Conference on Soviet Jewry and the New York Conference on Soviet Jewry. It was in City Hall Park, and Ed Koch was a staunch supporter of the struggle and the campaign. Next slide, please. The ultimate tools on behalf of Soviet Jews, as far as the American Jewish community was concerned, were members of Congress. Here we have a group, Representative Alphonse D'Amato and Dante Fascell, who were the co-chairs of something called the Helsinki Commission, which we helped organize. The commission was opposed by Nixon and Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State, but at some point, Kissinger relented, and in fact, he became a member of the commission itself. Their objective was to monitor the procedures of the signatory nations to the Helsinki Final Act, which took place in 1975. And it was a useful weapon on our behalf and on behalf of Soviet Jews, but it was a tool that we could use, and I think we used it quite effectively. Congressional delegations were encouraged to visit refuseniks in the Soviet Union. This particular one, in winter, I worked with a number of congressmen, and here we're standing in St. Petersburg. We visited refuseniks. They had a very difficult time leaving at the airport, despite the fact that we had the American consul with us as a protective device. Their luggage was searched, and mine in particular was torn apart. Suitcases linings were ripped. We missed our flight, and when we asked the Soviet officials, okay, we've met with refuseniks, you know that. How do we get out? That's your problem. Well, eventually we managed to get a flight back to Moscow and then out to Vienna. So the congressional delegations were very important in terms of demonstrating American political power. As I indicated, the ultimate goal was to reach the White House. It was the president who was the interlocutor with Soviet officials, not us. But we exerted pressure, and I must say that Ronald Reagan was very receptive, and he was known as a cold warrior, but we ignored that appellation. And there was a meeting with Ronald Reagan and Jewish leaders in September of '87. His mission, and he accepted it readily, was to take our message and convey it to Mikhail Gorbachev and Soviet officials. If I noted that our mission was, and our tool was to use American officials wherever possible, Israel was a key benefactor of the emigration of Soviet Jews, and we had delegations meeting with officials in Jerusalem, this one with the prime minister at the time, and Yitzhak Shamir, but we also worked very closely with Israeli officials at this end. In the end, most Soviet Jews who emigrated and who were allowed out went to Israel. And so Israel felt that they had a special mission and obligation to be engaged. Indeed, they started early on with secret operations, tapping into the Soviet Jewish community and bringing out information when no one else had that available. They were an invaluable ally. The penultimate public demonstration, for those who are involved or those who know about it, was the December 6, 1987 Washington demonstration on the eve of the Reagan-Gorbachev summit. We had over 250,000 people who participated, mostly Jews, but also many non-Jews, nuns, priests, academics, and of course, the base of the Jewish community. They came in by bus, they came in by plane and landed at the airport and came in by bus. They came on foot, some came on bicycle, and it was an awesome gathering. As you can see, the Washington Monument in the back and the steps of the Capitol in front of us. And we found out that Ronald Reagan, when he met with Gorbachev the next day, was able to take a newspaper and say, see, the newspaper's headlines were "Thousands gathered for Soviet Jews." And he was able to tell Mr. Gorbachev, this is an issue that I need to have resolved, and Mr. Gorbachev, you need to have resolved. I noted earlier that Leonid Slepak was on the steps of the labor union building opposite the Soviet embassy. This was in Washington, D.C. Well, success. His parents, Masha and Vladimir, also known affectionately to people in the movement as Volodya Slepak, they are surrounding Elie Wiesel. Elie was an advocate for Soviet Jews going back many, many years. And this was on the dais, or I should say the platform, with members of Congress, other notables who were here for that demonstration on December 6th, Solidarity Sunday. And as far as I'm concerned, that was the peak of the Soviet Jewry advocacy movement. And thereafter, Jews began to come out. Following 91, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Jews were allowed out. Jews were able to build their Jewish life once more. So this man, of course, was the ultimate decision maker as far as Jewish emigration was concerned. And as long as he was premier, and it didn't last long, Mikhail Gorbachev relented and began to allow Jews to come out. And we met with him, and here I'm thanking him. He was very polite, and he indicated he knew what the issues were and that we could count on him in the days of perestroika and glasnost of openness to solve the issues affecting Jewish minority in the Soviet Union. He wanted Jews to remain, but we indicated that Jews wanted to leave based on years of discrimination and families in Israel, and he understood. And so we thanked him. And that was the peak of the movement, as I suggested earlier. And Gorbachev was the eventual decision maker, not Mr. Reagan, not any of us, but himself as premier. And in fact, nearly 200,000 Jews were, I'm sorry, nearly over 2 million Jews, nearly 3 million Jews eventually left.
Thank you very much, Jerry. And Semyon, would you please give us your presentation?
Yes, thank you, Robert. Hello, Jerry. We know each
Hello,
other for
Semyon.
many years. On April 1st, 1976, that's a full day, right? Fool's Day. Oh, but because it's a leap day, my wife said things will work differently. We applied for immigration. And then we didn't know what was happening with our application, but 3-4 weeks later, my neighbor stopped me on the street and said the head of a local police precinct came to him and was asking about me and my wife. And I asked, what did he ask you? He said, well, he asked what kind of people you are and things like that. So at that moment, I understood that our application was being considered. Now, 2 weeks later, we got a call from visa office and they invited my wife for conversation. So she came in, they asked her all sorts of questions, trying to figure it out if she knows state secrets or so on. And then said, well, you can go now. You'll find out what will happen to you later on. A few days later, we received a postcard saying your application was received and you were granted exit visa from the Soviet Union. So I came to the visa office and I said, okay, what should I do now? And they said, well, you have to go across the street to the local bank, pay large sum of money actually for dropping your citizenship. I said, why? I'm not, I'm not considering dropping my citizenship. He said, that's the rule. If you take this visa, exit visa, into your hands, that means your citizenship will be dropped. I said, okay. I went out, crossed the street, paid, got the receipt, came back, gave my passports, mine and my wife's, gave the receipt. Instead, they gave me a paper. That's the piece of paper I got instead with my picture in it, which indicates that this is my last name, first name, patronymic name, and it says I have to leave Soviet Union before June 25th, 1976. This piece of paper was the most important thing people were looking for at that time. Without this exit visa, we couldn't leave that. Now, but to have that visa, that wasn't enough to solve our problems because everything would happen in between. And I know the cases with my best friends when they received such an exit visa like one you just saw. And 3 days later, they received a call from the visa office informing them that the visa was canceled. Now, they had a month to prepare. They empty their apartment, send out all the goods, sold whatever they could sell. My friends had 2 little children on their hands, right? And then 5 days before their departure, they were told they won't be able to go. They will stay. And you know what? It took them 10 years before they were allowed to immigrate from the Soviet Union. And now they live in Israel. I knew that. I was so concerned that I told my wife, please be careful. Don't talk on the phone. Don't be sure that whom you're talking to on the street and things like that, because everything can happen. I will believe we left the Soviet Union only when I get off the plane in Vienna. That's the only time I will believe it, because prior to that, everything can happen. So I had a cousin who won 2 international piano competitions. He was quite well known, but he wasn't exposed to any state secrets at all. In 1979, he applied for immigration, and he was denied. And there was no explanation why. They just denied it, and that's it. And I understood that I have to help him. And then I began to work on this, and I found Jerry Goodman and his organization, and a private public relation firm, Gladney Communication. Remember that, Jerry? Norman Gladney? Right. And we were able to raise enough awareness. So at the end, we got enough funds, enough interest. So on June 14th, 1982, we produced a concert for Vladimir Feltsman. We invited him, actually Jerry's organization invited him to perform in New York, but we knew in advance that the Russians won't let him go. So there was somebody had to substitute him. And those substitute was Misha Dichter, very famous pianist, Helen Hayes, you know, I don't have to tell you who she was, Gutia Curtin, ballerina, Tony Randall, and other artists were present. So everything was made to bring a world attention to the case of Vladimir Feltsman. And finally, Russians understood that it's easier to let him go than to keep him in. And he was allowed to go. A few years later, he finally arrived at Kennedy Airport, and this picture was taken on their arrivals. But with the efforts of Norman Gladney and Jerry's organization, we made so much effort that the White House got interested in this case too. And the Reagans invited Vladimir Feltsman to perform his first concert at the White House. And you see this picture demonstrating that. This is after the concert when he played. And of course, the interest to his performance was growing up and up. And later on in this year, on November 10th, I believe, of same year, his concert was announced at the Carnegie Hall in New York. And this is the poster of his. And he's staying actually in my winter coat because he didn't have his own coat. I have to give it to him. And that's how this story ended, with a happy end, but only because so many people got involved and so many people were helpful.
Great. Thank you, Semyon. Wonderful story. Now I will share with you that from May 15th to May 21st, 1988, I was privileged to lead a group of physicians and their spouses to both Moscow and Leningrad, where we visited 18 refusenik families. Prior to the visit, we were intensively trained how to respond to any interrogations we may have subjected to while entering, traveling, or exiting the Soviet Union. Our charge was to monitor, report on both their physical and mental health conditions. And while doing so, we videotaped testimonies for distribution in the West and also brought them medicines, a physician's desk reference, PDR, which we divided into numerous sections, with each one of us hiding them in our suitcases. And additionally, we delivered copies on VHS at that time, tapes of Claude Lanzmann's 1985 and 9.5-hour film Shoah. We had a, needless to say, exciting time meeting the Soviet refuseniks, and we're very pleased to report back and distribute the film to those within the general community. Here are some slides relating to that visit I took. Here you will see a translation of an anti-Semitic screed poster that was nailed to the front of buildings where Soviet Jews would meet to be able to converse with each other, to be able to get together. You can read what they wrote. And again, this is part of the continuing anti-Semitism in the name of the Soviet state and the Soviet citizens or patriots that Jews clearly were not a part of. And one of the reasons why they needed and they wanted to leave the Soviet Union. These are just, again, 3x5 cards that each one of us, this was my rendition of the information I had on the people we would meet and contact information for them when we were in, again, in either Moscow or Leningrad. We could not use the telephones in our rooms, and we could not say anything because not only were the phones monitored, but we also were told that quite likely the rooms were. So every morning, one of us would leave and find a telephone booth somewhere on the street to make the time to call people who we were designated to call for that particular day, got information of what stop we should enter for the trains below ground, the underground in either one of the cities, be told which car to sit on, which door to exit, and there would be an identifiable individual on the platform we should then follow, and we would eventually arrive at somebody's apartment. Needless to say, we stood out like sore thumbs, but we were never hassled in that process. This is a report in the Northern California Jewish Bulletin, where I am there happily, smiling with one of the dissidents, Vladimir Davshensky, and his two children. He became an Orthodox Jew while in the Soviet Union and became a Hebrew teacher. That was, again, some of the information that I accrued or experiences that the group and I had in the Soviet Union. Now, Dorit, you have an interesting story to share as well, please.
Thank you, Robert. Let my people go. I began advocating for the freedom of Soviet Jews as a teenager. I, along with countless others, stood in front of the Soviet embassy in San Francisco on Sunday mornings. By happy coincidence, I learned that Robert was also in that crowd, and maybe some of you here as well. I made and held signs demanding the release of Soviet refuseniks, organized petition drives, lobbied Congress, and eventually, as a young attorney, drafted political asylum appeals. The Soviet Union's restrictive and draconian immigration policy was a violation of basic human and civil rights. Many doubted the ability of a small group of American protesters to impact the political will of the mighty Soviet Union. They were wrong. Those demonstrations were eventually backed by our government's exertion of diplomatic pressure on the Russians. And as Jerry detailed earlier, in 1987, when Gorbachev came to the United States, President Ronald Reagan famously stated, "You have no choice but to release Soviet Jewry." In other words, let my people go. A quick word about HIAS, the organization I became involved in. The Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, today known by its acronym HIAS, is the Jewish agency that supports refugees and immigrants. From its early roots in New York City in 1881, HIAS has welcomed refugees from the pogroms of East Europe, Holocaust survivors, Hungarian Jews fleeing the Soviet invasion, Iranian Jews escaping a choking theocracy, and Soviet Jews who had survived communism and its attempt to wipe out Jewish culture. It is likely that HIAS welcomed your parents or grandparents. In 1881, Beginning in a modest storefront on the Lower East Side, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society provided first meals and clothing to newly arrived refugees, assisted with housing, and worked to connect families. By 1904, HIAS established a bureau on Ellis Island and installed a kosher kitchen. You will see that HIAS has organized the Seder for the newly arrived. HIAS continued to help Jewish refugees. In 1917, for example, more than 600 immigrants were detained on Ellis Island in just 1 month because they had neither money nor relatives to claim them. HIAS stepped in with financial assistance and connections. In New York, HIAS continued with housing assistance, job training, and a weekly bazaar to help the refugees furnish their new lives. More than a century later, the iron gates of the Soviet Union opened. And as the gates opened, the pent-up demand, frustration, and fear led to the mass exodus of Soviet Jews. They fled the Soviet Union through the Vienna Gateway and made their way by train to Rome. This next slide shows the refugees arriving. At that moment, I was catapulted into action. I went from dedicated volunteer and a Sunday sign holder to chief legal counsel for HIAS in Rome. This photo shows Soviet refugees arriving at the train station in Rome. I went there weekly to greet the new arrivals. Here you see the luggage securely tied with twine. All the precious possessions that you can put into 2 pieces of luggage. A lifetime of accomplishments and hopes. One image, one memory that I still hold vividly is the sheer number of musical instruments being passed carefully along. Violins, accordions, trumpets, and more violins. It spoke to their culture and background. Arriving in Rome was just one step in a long and frustrating journey full of uncertainty. This was an old and familiar story for Jews, but new in its details. Here, in the next slide, you see a family waiting in Rome. Rome was a processing center for the then named United States Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS. In previous years, the INS in Rome was staffed to an appropriate level to process the trickle of refugee applicants. With the Soviet gates opening and Soviet Jews uncertain how long they would remain open, a flood of applicants overwhelmed the meager resources of the Rome INS office. There was much to be done to secure an INS hearing interview and complete medical exams. The delays and backlogs were mounting. Some families experienced a frustrating 10-month delay in Rome. They were in limbo, having lost their Soviet citizenship, not being able to begin lives in Italy, and waiting for an uncertain future. HIAS worked to assist the families and secure their onward passage, many to be reunited with family members they had not seen in a decade. Here, you see families being reunited in New York City at JFK Airport. HIAS was at the airport, as it is today, as it was in Ellis Island in 1880s, to welcome refugees and help them on their way. During that time period, more than 140,000 Soviet Jews came to the United States, and eventually, more than 1.5 million Jews would leave the Soviet Union. 1.5 million. Let my people go indeed. Today, I'm proud to serve on the board of HIAS, an organization that since 1881 has brought more than 4.5 million refugees to freedom. HIAS builds on over a century of experience to rescue and resettle today's refugees, regardless of national origin. We do this not because they're Jewish, but because we're Jewish. We have a particular responsibility to welcome refugees. For as it says in Deuteronomy, we too were strangers in the land of Egypt. Ki garim hayinu be'eretz Mitzrayim. The global refugee crisis is at its highest level ever, with more than 80 million refugees worldwide. In many locations, HIAS is the only United Nations authorized agency to help refugees. And in Vienna, we continue to keep the pipeline open as the sole refugee agency designated by the United States State Department. We stand at the ready in the event that Jews anywhere need our help. Let my people go. Shlach et ami. Let all people go and let them live in freedom from fear.
Thank you, Dorit. That was so moving. And I neglected to say at the top of the hour that HIAS is co-sponsoring today's program. And I'm so grateful to HIAS for your willingness to partner with us on this very important subject. So before we get to your questions, I see there are a lot of questions. I would like to briefly tell about some of our upcoming programs. Most importantly, save the date. August 29th, we're going to have Natan Sharansky as our guest for a second follow-up program on today's theme of the rescue of Soviet Jewry. So he has autographed copies of his new autobiography called Never Alone, Prison, Politics, and My People. And he will be here to meet you and to answer your questions. And we have copies of his book available for you. So registration is not yet open for that program, but it will open soon. So please save the date of August 29th. I'm very excited. Next week, we are going back a few decades to a story from the 1930s, which has to do with Hitler and Mussolini's support of Franco in Spain. So Franco was a fascist dictator in Spain, and there were brigades that came from all over the world to fight Franco, to fight fascism, including a brigade from the United States called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And as it turns out, fully 1/3 of the US volunteers who went to fight fascism in Spain were in fact Jewish, 1/3 of them, because they knew what fascism meant. And so next week, we are partnering with an organization called ALBA, which is the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives, to present a story called Salud y Shalom, American Jews in the Spanish Civil War. It's a free program, just like today's program, and I hope you will all sign up. In 2 weeks, we go back to looking at the Holocaust, at resistance during the Holocaust, and we're focusing in on one particular very important figure named Abba Kovner, who was the leader of the partisans in Vilna in Lithuania. And we are showing the very important landmark film, Partisans of Vilna. And so we hope you will join us for that as well. And right now we're going to see a little trailer for that film so that you see Abba Kovner at the Eichmann trial, where he was a star witness reading his own manifesto from when he was the leader of the partisans of Vilna.
היטלר זמן להשמיד את כל יהודי אירופה. על יהודי ליטא יצא להיות בגורלם בתור ראשון. אמת נכון, אנחנו חלשים וחסרי מגן, אבל התשובה היחידה לרוצח היא התגוננות. אחים, מוטב ליפול כלוחמים בני חורין מאשר לחיות בחסד המרצחים. להתגונן, להתגונן עד נשימתנו האחרונה.
גזירות חדשות מדי יום, משפילות, מדכאות, חטיפות. בתור ילדה צעירה אולי לא זוכרת שתפסתי, הרגשתי רק את ההשפלה. למה אני צריכה להיות מסומנת בטלאי צהוב? מדוע אסור ללכת על המדרכה בווילנה שלי, בעיר שגדלתי?
Der Ziel zu der Gegenstellung im Ghetto, verteidigen den jüdischen Covid, führen einen Sabotageakt, arriba führen dem dosigen Gedanken.
ואז החלטנו לפוצץ רכבת, כדבר ראשון.
כששמנו רק את הפצצה, מהר ברחנו, וכשרצנו בדרך, שמענו את הפיצוץ מרחוק.
המעניין לציין הוא, כשאירע הפיצוץ, אז בעיתונות המחתרת ואחרת, ליטאים אמרו שעשו את זה, לפולנים אמרו שעשו את זה, איש לא עלה בדעתו שעשתה איזה בחורה, ועם כמה בחורים מתוך הגטו.
Die jüdische Partisaner sind gewöhnt zu werfen in die verschiedenen Einheiten, russische, litwische, polnische. Wenn sie gekommen, Glasmann mit seiner Gruppe, hat Glasmann zusammen mit den Chaveren genommen, organisiert eine jüdische Einheit, welche soll verschreiben, vernotieren, die jüdische Gewürre auf Verhältnis von jüdischem Volk.
הגענו לווילנה המשוחררת, ואני זוכרת את עצמי הולכת ברחוב, מולי הולכת אישה וילד, ופתאום אני שומעת מדברים יידיש. ואני, שהייתי אז די נוקשה, אני חושבת שבמשך כל זמן היה לא בכיתי, כמו שלא צחקתי, פתאום נעמדתי באמצע הרחוב, ופרצתי בבכי קולני. זה היה כל כך מפתיע בפני עצמי. קודם כל, אני נדהמתי שאני מסוגלת לבכות. כמו שפעם נדהמתי שאני עוד מסוגלת לצחוק. אבל זאת הייתה, זה קשה בכלל להבין, שאני זכיתי לראות ילד יהודי חי.
לא עלה בדעתנו שאנחנו סתם ניכנע. ואנחנו לא נכנענו.
Okay, so now we turn to your questions. And the first question is for you, Mr. Jerry Goodman. Jerry, please unmute yourself. And the question for you is, how did you manage to organize a group of 250,000 people to all descend on Washington for that famous march? How did you do that?
It was very simple. We just let the Jewish community organize itself. Every local Jewish Community Relations Council, every national organization set upon itself to bring together as many people as possible. Trains were rented, buses were rented, they were chartered, airplanes were chartered, and we had no idea whether there would be 100,000 people or 250,000. Well, miracle of miracles, the Jewish community came and did what it had to do. The National Conference was only the top channel to set the mood, but it was the local people, as always in the Soviet Jewry movement, it was the local people who did it.
Now, another question, this one perhaps is for Semyon. And the question is, was this global effort to free the Soviet Jews related to the collapse of the Soviet Union? Did it deliberately lead in some way to the collapse? Were they connected?
That's a difficult question to answer. My first impression, I think it's two different things. Actually, Soviet Union relented and let Jewish people to immigrate under the pressure from the United States. If you remember Jackson-Vanik Amendment, trade between Soviet Union and the United States was dependent on Jewish immigration. I think that did a lot. That did a lot. So sanctions do work. But to say the Soviet Union collapsed because of the Soviet immigration, to the extent, yes, because the more people were out, the more information about life in the West and Israel was coming in. And that was probably very educational for the rest of the country.
So, Jerry, you spoke about the United States, you spoke about Great Britain, but what about Canada? Can you speak a little bit about the role of Canada in this effort?
Some of the strongest advocates for Soviet Jews were not only in the United States, but in Canada, France, Holland. So it was a global venture. The Canadians were terrific, and they had a group called the 35, which emulated the 35s in London. And Montreal was the seat of a very active community. I myself went up there a number of times to meet with the leadership and brief them. So by all means, Canadian Jews were partners, full-fledged partners, smaller community, but to the extent that Canadians could do it, or the Brits, or the French, or the Dutch, everyone was part of it. And there was a World Conference on Soviet Jewry, which brought all of us together periodically to share experiences and tactics. And by the way, Semyon, a point. I don't think that the Soviet Union disintegrated because of Jewish emigration. On the contrary, they would have loved to have kept Jewish technology and Jewish skills in the Soviet Union, but it was already corroding from within. The Soviet economy was collapsing. It was a widespread despair. What we helped do is push it over the brink. And that's what the Soviet Jewry movement did. So we had an important part, but we certainly didn't do it alone.
So Dorit, there are a few questions to do with the role of HIAS today. So I'm going to ask you all three together.
Okay.
What is HIAS doing to help in Cuba is number one. What is HIAS doing to help French Jews? And is there any HIAS activity going on at the US-Mexican border?
Sure, let me handle that. HIAS has been involved with the Cuban Jewish community since 1959, helping Cuban refugees. And HIAS has many offices in Central America, in Colombia, in Peru, in Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica, Aruba. So this is usually the first place where we encounter people escaping from Cuba and are able to help them in that way. And in fact, just before the pandemic started, a young Cuban family arrived in San Francisco, and I was able to meet them as well. So that effort continues through our many regional offices. In terms of French Jewry, there isn't the refugee situation happening there. I think at the moment, French Jews are able to freely leave and exit, and certainly many of them have chosen to come to Israel, where there are a great number of them escaping. In terms of HIAS's work at the border, we are very, very active at the border. HIAS has attorneys staffed both in El Paso and in San Diego to provide legal help. And HIAS is very active on the Mexican side at various border cities, Matamoros through Tijuana. We have a staff of about 40 on our legal team there, helping people with their applications and the entire legal process to enter the United States.
Great. So this is a question for Jerry Goodman, and it's about conflicts. So can you discuss conflicts between the NCSJ and the UCSJ? First of all, what are these two organizations? And what was the conflict between them, and was it resolved?
There was, as I mentioned in the beginning, there were three major groups campaigning for Soviet Jews. The Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, which became part of the NCSJ, the National Conference on Soviet Jewry, which I helped organize and direct. And there was the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews, which was an independent, much smaller, but a very vocal, very active, independent coalition of groups across the country. What was it all about? To this day, I could not tell you exactly. Everyone had their favorites, and the Union of Councils did not wish to be part of the National Conference. And if there are any Union of Council people listening, my own view is that they were afraid of being swallowed up by the much larger entity. And they did a very important job. They created links to Jews in the Soviet Union, them personally, many traveled. They had information sources that we didn't have. And so eventually there was a sharing. No movement that I know of is 100% universal. Most political movements have factions within, and that was the case in the Soviet Jewry movement, especially with Jews. And where do you sit down with 10 Jews where all 10 Jews could agree on anything? So the Soviet Jewry movement was not much different.
Okay, there's a question about Zhirinovsky, who was apparently contender for Soviet leadership and an anti-Semite. What was his role in this whole process?
You mean Zhirinovsky, right?
Yes.
Well, he was head of the Communist Party. He had no role in our movement. He came into power essentially, or fought for power after the Soviet Jewry movement had peaked, after most Soviet Jews who wished to leave left, and his struggle was within the Soviet Union. He dominated the Communist Party there. He wanted national leadership. He never achieved it. And today he is a marginal figure in in Russian society. I don't know what else. Semyon, do you have a comment?
Yes, I would like to comment. Very interesting figure. I think he's a KGB operative because as a young man, he was working in the Russian embassy in Turkey, and because he was learning Turkish language. You know, in the Soviet Union, you don't just go. You prefer to learn English or French or Spanish, but not Turkish. If you're fluent in Turkish, that means somebody asked you to do that. So he was doing that. Now his mother is Russian, his father is Jewish. His father died in Israel and buried in Israel. But in the beginning, when he became well known in Russia, in the political circles, when he was asked who is he by nationality, and remember, in Russia, even today, Jewish is not a religion, Jewish is nationality, right? It's the only country in the world like this. So when he was asked that question, who is by nationality, he said, my mother is Russian, my father is a lawyer. That was his famous answer. He allowed himself to be anti-Semitic when he wanted to be. He allowed himself to be pro-Jewish when he felt it's good for him. He is not an independent politician. I think he's a puppet in the hands of security services.
Okay, we're getting to the end of our hour, so I'd like to turn back to our speakers for their final thoughts. Mr. Jerry Goodman, what would you like to say to our audience?
Without the involvement of American Jews and non-Jews alike, and I'm speaking now to the American people, not to Canadians, not to other countries, the liberation of Soviet Jews might never have taken place. The ability of Soviet Jews to eventually create Jewish communal institutions might never have taken place. And I think this was a glorious page in American Jewish history, long remembered, and something to pass on to generations to come.
Semyon, my dear friend, what about you?
Well, things with the Russian Jews are different now than when I was living there. They can freely move from Russia to Israel. And even on if you want to be a tourist to go to Israel, they don't need a visa. They have an agreement now between Russia and Israel. So you have a passport, you just go there. You don't need a visa. So it looks good. There are Jewish schools now, which is unbelievable. There are the Jewish cultural centers. It's unbelievable. The Chabad is very active in Russia. Everything looks wonderful, except the history. And the history teaches us things can change overnight into such a way that you didn't anticipate it. If we remember our history, beginning with Emperor Constantine, with the Spanish Inquisition, with the Portuguese Inquisition, with the Dreyfus affair in France, with Bailey's affair and Dr. Platz in the Soviet Union. 2,000 years of history teaches us, enjoy your life, but be careful.
Wow, what a cautionary word of ending. Dorit, what would you like to say to our audience?
Say that the words "let my people go" echo throughout our history. And for those of us that have the freedom to advocate and the power to do so, we must continue relentlessly.
Robert.
I'd like to thank Jerry for allowing me to find him so he would be on the panel today. And Semyon, I knew of you, and I know you better now, and I appreciate who you are and what you've done. And Dorit, it's been wonderful to meet you and to know from way back I shouldn't say way back in your teenage days to today, you're still active with HIAS as a board member. And I did share with you, and I'll share with others, that when I was in high school back in Boston, I was working at HIAS as an after-school job. So I have known for 35, 40 years about HIAS. And I'm sure my Russian Jewish family were indeed assisted by HIAS when they entered this country. So to all three of you, I greatly appreciate your willingness and wonderful presentations. Thank you. And of course, thank you to Olivia for wrapping it all up for us. It's greatly appreciated.
So again, save the date, August 29th, Natan Sharansky in person to answer your questions. And we will have his autographed books available for you. And I'm so excited about that. So thanks to our audience that comes week after week. Thank you, Robert, for your expert moderation. And thank you to all of our illustrious speakers. And to you, our audience, see you next week. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.